Welcome to the Unitarian Church of Lincoln on this Sunday morning. My name is the Reverend Oscar Sinclair. Each week since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic last March, our congregation has gathered together at least twice. On Thursday night, when we tend to our community and each other directly on Zoom, and on this service on Sunday morning, broadcast on YouTube. Sunday morning, whether in person or on YouTube, is a chance to proclaim who we are and what we are about, throwing open the doors of the congregation and proclaiming the radical love and welcome that is at the very heart of our shared faith. The Unitarian Church of Lincoln aspires to be a loving community, we say, uniting reason with spiritual experience to transform ourselves and the world. And right now, in this year when so much is uncertain, we know that transformation is necessary. This is the place. This is the time. Who will we be? How will we be? In this time of anxiety and pandemic and fear, what are we called to be as a community? This is, as the Reverend Susan Frederick Gray puts it, no time for a casual faith and no time to go it alone. And this, right here, right now, is where we practice that. So take a moment as we begin. Be present right here, right now. Let go of what you've carried here, set aside what will come later. Be right here. There is work to be done. Let's be about it.
Miles Davis said, "I'm always thinking about creating. My future starts when I wake up in the morning and see the light." Each week, we light a chalice that symbolizes the spirit of our community. As we do so, let's consider what future we might create as we wake up this morning and see the light.
Our story today is called The Big Orange Splot, and it's written by Daniel Manus Pinkwater. Mr. Plumbean lived on a street where all the houses were the same. He liked it that way. So did everybody else on Mr. Plumbean's street. They said, "This is a neat street." Then one day, a seagull flew over Mr. Plumbean's house. And he was carrying a can of bright orange paint. No one knows why. And he dropped the can, no one knows why, right over Mr. Plumbean's house. It made a big orange splot on Mr. Plumbean's house. "Oh, too bad," everybody said. "Mr. Plumbean will have to paint his house again." "I suppose I will," said Mr. Plumbean. But he didn't paint his house right away. He looked at the big orange spot for a long time, and then he went about his business. The neighbors got tired of seeing that big orange spot. Someone said, "Mr. Plumbean, we wish you'd get around to painting your house." "Okay," said Mr. Plumbean. So he got some blue paint and some white paint. And that night he got busy. He painted it at night because it was cooler. And when the paint was gone, the roof was blue, the walls were white, and the big orange spot was still there. Then he got some more paint. He got red paint, yellow paint, green paint, and purple paint. And in the morning, the other people on the street came out of their houses. Their houses were all the same, but Mr. Plumbean's house was like a rainbow. It was like a jungle. It was like fun had exploded on his house. There was the big orange spot. And there were little orange spots too. And there were stripes, and there were pictures of elephants and lions and people and steam shovels. And the people said, Plumbean has popped his cork, flipped his wig, blown his stack, and dropped his stopper. And they went away muttering. That day, Mr. Plumbean bought carpenter's tools. That night, he built a tower on top of his roof, and he painted a clock on the tower. And the next day, the people said, Plumbean has gushed his mush, lost his marbles, and slipped his houser. They decided they would pretend not to notice. And that very night, Mr. Plumbean got a truck full of green things. He planted palm trees, baobabs, thorn bushes, onions, and Frankie Panny. And in the morning, he bought a hammock and an alligator. And when the people came out of their houses, they saw Mr. Plumbean swinging in a hammock between the two palm trees. They saw an alligator lying in the grass, and Mr. Plumbean was drinking lemonade. Plumbean has gone too far. This used to be a neat street. Plumbean, what have you done to your house? The people shouted. My house is me, and I am it. My house is where I like to be, and it looks like all my dreams, Mr. Plumbean said. The people went away. They asked the man who lived next door to Mr. Plumbean to go and have a talk with him. Tell him that we all liked it here before he changed his house. Tell him that his house has to be the same as ours so we can have a neat street. The man went to see Mr. Plumbean that evening. They sat under the palm trees drinking lemonade and talking all night long. And early the next morning, the man went out to get lumber and rope and nails and paint. And when the people came out of their houses, they saw a red and yellow ship next door to the house of Mr. Plumbean. What have you done to your house? They shouted at the man. My house is me and I am it. My house is where I like to be, and it looks like all my dreams, said the man, who always loved ships. He's just like Plumbean, the people said. He's got bees in his bonnet, bats in his belfry, and knots in his noodle. Then one by one, they went to see Mr. Plumbean late at night. They would sit under the palm trees and drink lemonade and talk about their dreams. And whenever anybody visited Mr. Plumbean's house, the very next day, the person would set about changing his own house to fit his dreams. And whenever a stranger came to the street of Mr. Plumbean and his neighbors, the stranger would say, this is not a neat street. Then all the people would say, our street is us, and we are it. Our street is where we like to be, and it looks like all of our dreams. And that is the end of our story. Now, even though this church year is not going to look like all the other church years, I can guarantee that it is going to be neat in many different wonderful ways, because we're going to paint our church in so many different creative colors and ways, and we're going to morph it into a castle and a hot air balloon and a ship and reshape church like we've never imagined a church could be reshaped. You might at times think that the church staff has gushed our mush and lost our marbles and that we have bees in our bonnet, but the Unitarian Church is us, and we are it. Our church is where we like to be, and it sure represents many of our collective dreams. I'm excited to see what the next year holds, and I'm so grateful to be here with all of you.
Our congregations live in two worlds. They're both corporations and communities. They bring comfort to the comfortable and deepen the anxiety of those who are already brokenhearted for our world and its wounds. And yet they also get it right, shaking the foundations of the smug and healing people who, by all odds, ought to be unhealable. To get it right, a congregation has to organize to make its big decisions in its best and deepest frame of mind. That's governance. It needs to organize to focus limited resources on its most important goals. That's ministry. It needs to work when it's tired, persist when it's sabotaged, recover when it fails, and when its plans fall short, it needs to improvise. In part, of course, all this depends on the condition, physical, emotional, and spiritual, of the leaders. It also depends on systems. Like people, systems carry their condition from the past into the future, a condition coded partly into bylaws, policies, and practices. Dan Hotchkiss.
What does it look like to be a church in the midst of a global pandemic? Last week, we started the year with a basic premise that we gather in these organized places of meaning-making because we are people who, by and large, take the big questions of life seriously. We know that the stakes are very high, and so we gather together. We're drawn to congregations in many ways, arriving out of what Ken Patton called many singular rooms. For some of us, it's a long engagement with philosophical or existential questions. Some of us have been knocked down a few times by life. Some of us just want a little help with raising our kids to be good and moral people. But whatever brings us here, we stay out of a shared commitment to this community. The church is the people in it and the connections that we form. So each year we gather to commit and recommit ourselves to this community. The question before us today, after the commitment last week, is simple. How will we be a church in the midst of global pandemic and uprising? Because right now, the world needs the Unitarian Church of Lincoln. Lincoln needs the Unitarian Church of Lincoln. We need houses of worship that proclaim that, yes, we will care about our neighbors. Yes, Black Lives Matter. And yes, the practice of democracy is a sacred obligation. And in this moment, I need, a community that will tell each other over and over again, as many times as it takes, take courage, friends. You are not alone. That's the why. There has never been a time in my life where it was more important for this faith community to exist. The how is a little more prosaic, but it is necessary. Because in this moment where the why is clear, almost every instinct in the social brains that we moderately evolved primates have is screaming, be with your people. Lock arms, stand strong, weather the storm together. In this moment, all of a sudden, locking arms can only be a metaphor. Because right now we cannot gather the way our instincts are calling. The bitterness of this pandemic is the way that this particular virus acts, counter to so much of human intuition. Asymptomatic transmission means that there is a lag between 2 weeks and a month between cause and effect. There's just enough personal choice involved, say, in the decision to wear a mask or go to a party on campus, that we can easily blame outbreaks on individual moral choices, which then takes attention away from systemic failures and fixes. And the president, and by extension the federal government, seems more focused on magical thinking than communicating any kind of complex, multifaceted solution to this complex, multifaceted problem. And so the irony is that in this moment where the instinct is to gather together, the requirement of public health and the moral imperative of the church is that we not gather in the ways that we have in the past. The question for us is not, how do we end the coronavirus pandemic? The question for us is how we are going to be a church in this moment. Now that's a question for all of us, but it's a particular question for this congregation's Board of Trustees. In Unitarian Universalism, the highest authority in the congregation is the gathered membership, voting together. To this end, we have at least 2 congregational meetings each year to approve the budget, to make decisions about big new initiatives, to elect leaders. But in the time between congregational meetings, it is the Board of Trustees that the congregation charges to represent the whole membership. This is a very specific role. It is not to run the church or even get involved in day-to-day management of programs. Those are tasks for the staff and for program council. The board role has 3 related but distinct pieces. First, the board has a fiduciary duty to ensure good stewardship of the congregation's resources. The board is the group that holds the generational mission of the church, the one that says we have been here for 150 years, and so we should make decisions assuming that we'll be here for another 150. Second, the board monitors on behalf of the congregation how we are meeting our mission and vision. And third, following from those first 2, the board considers and sets priorities for the congregation in the course of each year. At a retreat last month, our board considered our mission and vision and the moment we are in, and set 3 priorities for the coming year at the Unitarian Church of Lincoln. So in the next year, we will focus on planning for an eventual return to the building for worship and programming. We'll develop our online offerings and technology to connect well during this time. And we'll engage in the work of racial justice in our congregation and in Lincoln. We'll start to explore these 3 priorities in more depth after some music.
This reading is called Country of Illusions by John Crossley Morgan. There must be some mistake. The road was here at least 5 years ago. I thought the road I sought was here. But straight ahead, as far as I can see, there is no road, and I must wait. As our next hymn plays, feel free to please type your name or the name of someone you know in the chat box to share your joys and your sorrows. We may not always know what lays ahead, but please know that your church community is here for you.
Key. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
We all want to be back in our building. Let's be honest about that. I am preaching to an empty room right now. From my perspective, here's what the sanctuary currently looks like. Now, to say this is not what I imagined ministry in Lincoln would look like is an understatement. And for many of our members, while technology is a good way to maintain connection, it has never been, and likely never will be, the primary way they relate to the church. Planning an eventual return to our building and programs and worship has been an implicit goal since March, but we're making it explicit now. Now, I did not imagine when we closed our space 6 months ago how long this time would be. I don't think any of us did. But it is necessary because, as I said last week, and I will say repeatedly over the next year, the church's first and highest moral duty is preserving life. This is not particularly debatable. As long as we are dealing with a not fully contained outbreak of COVID-19 in our city, the Unitarian Church of Lincoln will do everything that we can to prevent or slow the transmission of the disease. What is more complicated, and what is indeed the priority, is this question of how we re-enter the church. To be clear, the list of things that we don't know, that we need to know, is very, very long. We need to know that there is a vaccine. We need to know that infection rates in Lincoln are under control. We need to develop protocols for what happens when there is a positive test of a member that attended worship. What the board priority does then is tells us that even though the questions are really hard to answer, we are going to spend time with them, in part because they are so hard to answer. It makes explicit this commitment. None of us want to have everyone back in this building more than the board, the staff, and the minister. I can promise you that that's the case. So even if I can't tell you when we will return to worshiping in this building, we're going to spend time and energy this year doing that right. But it's not enough to simply plan for a return to the church building. We cannot simply wait for COVID-19 to pass while we plan for what comes next. Last week, I talked about the life of faith being first an acknowledgement that the stakes are very high and an agreement that we are going to get through it together. What does not work, what cannot work, is simply saying, we're going to take a break from being a church because navigating this online stuff is too hard. The great irony of this moment in history is that it is a time that demands connection. Pandemic, large social change, and an election all at once. I don't know about you, but my instinct in these moments is to reach out, to be with people, to sit on porches and in sanctuaries, to gather with friends and family and say, we're going to ride out this storm together. So we need to continue to find and develop paths of connection. And right now, most of those, not all of those, but most, are based in technology. Over the last months, we've tried many new ways of connecting the congregation. We've had Zoom worship on Thursday nights, broadcasts on Sunday morning on YouTube, UU Connect groups, town halls, virtual retreats, game nights, movie nights, story times, socially distanced art projects, virtual choirs. This has not been accidental. It's an attempt to find, at times by throwing a bunch of spaghetti at the programmatic wall, to see what kinds of connection are valuable to folks in this time of distancing. This brings us to the next priority that the board identified as part of their retreat last month: that we will spend time, effort, and resources this year to continue to leverage technology to facilitate connections within the congregation. And there's a difference between what we did in the spring and what we're doing now. This spring, we had to jump online very, very quickly. And much of what we put together in those early days reflected that. Our early Sunday services were recorded from living rooms on web cameras on Zoom. And while it was important to do that, this fall, we're able to do some of this work more intentionally. We're recording this sermon in the sanctuary on cameras meant for video recording, with some intention around how we frame shots and record audio. This is part of what we're trying to do more of in the coming year, because there's another piece of this. While for many of our folks, technology is a kind of crutch that we're using to get through this time, it is also true that for others in the congregation, the things that we are able to do with technology allow them to connect more deeply with the congregation. Take, for instance, a member that works on Saturday night. A year ago, it would be hard for that person to come to the church early on Sunday morning. But now they can watch the service on Monday afternoon. Or a member unable to leave their house for reasons of health or weather. Now they can attend a small group meeting on Zoom with friends from the church. These are things that will still be important after we gather back in this building. So the investments we make in technology and skills to weather this time of pandemic are not solely about this moment. They're about how we can be a congregation of connection and care in the 2020s and beyond. All that, though, only matters if we have something to say. And that's where we'll pick up after the offering.
Each week, we take up an offering to support this congregation and its partners in the wider community. We do so because we all benefit from the work of the congregation in ways both seen and unseen, from volunteers to the art in the gallery to the musical groups. There are numerous ways that these contributions help further the work of the Unitarian Church of Lincoln. Since we are apart in these strange times, we are doing these contributions primarily through text. If you would like to give this morning, text UC Lincoln and the amount to 73256. Once again, that is UC Lincoln and the amount to 73256. Thank you for your generosity.
we could have the finest, most polished online offerings in Lincoln, and a compelling and well thought out plan for returning to our building. But that means very little if we do not say anything. This is a time, not just of pandemic, but of tremendous reckoning with the legacies of racism and systemic injustice in our country. And so we come to the last and in some ways most important of our congregation's priorities for the year. We are going to talk about race. I'm not going to pretend that this will be an easy thing for us. For those of us who are white and who move through the world from a location of privilege, talking about that privilege can be really hard. And for those who are not white, this reckoning comes with another set of challenges entirely. And it's worth noting the dialogue around race and how we engage with it is a contentious issue in the presidential campaign. It has become a part of the culture wars. It should not be a matter of great cultural import to declare that Black Lives Matter. And yet here we are. And this conversation isn't new. A while back in a sermon, I mentioned coming from Baltimore. I talked about the TV show The Wire and the historian Mark Morrison Reed. And then I went on to say this. Just in the last 10 minutes, I identified Mark Morrison Reed as a Black historian of Unitarian Universalism. But I did not identify David Simon as a white Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. This was intentional in order to make this point, but the many times we do this without thinking sets up whiteness as normative, as a default, while everything else is an exception, the aberration from the norm. And this is not just an issue of language. Centering whiteness by nature diminishes the dignity of people of color. This has consequences, from hiring practices to how the Baltimore police treated Freddie Gray. It is because of this that we proclaim, despite the evidence of the evening news, that Black Lives Matter. This is what the teach-in was about last spring, to increase our awareness and understanding of the logic of white supremacy, how even without knowing, we can so often center whiteness. This has been wrapped into our churches, entangled in our culture in ways that will take decades of sustained effort to end. Now that excerpt is from the first sermon that I preached in this church as the called minister, back in August of 2017. Since then, we've done more teach-ins, put up a Black Lives Matter banner, deepened our relationship with churches and activists of color in Lincoln. We appointed a task force to help guide us through this work of engaging with and dismantling systemic white supremacy. And there is more to do. And this is the year we're going to do it. This is part of who we are. Unitarian Universalism begins with the recognition that all have inherent worth and dignity. We know theologically that we are tied together in a single garment of mutuality. And we listen to reason, to evidence. We are able enough and open enough to see that racism is not just an issue of whether or not an individual has hate or love in their heart. We know, we can recognize that 1,000 of little decisions, biases in the system that build up over years, decades, and communities can have a catastrophic impact. So that's it. All we have to do this year is figure out how to have robust online connections, decide how and when we return to in-person events after a global pandemic, and while we're at it, address systemic racism in greater depth than we have before. No pressure. But if we come here because we know that the stakes are very high, we stay here because we know that together we can do big things. This congregation has weathered economic downturns and pandemics before. It has built a new church, renovated itself, rethought worship, helped found Planned Parenthood and the ACLU in this state. We can do big things here. We have, and we will. Amen.